Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special program, Variations on a Theme, dedicated to the scores of Benjamin Patterson. I'm Andrew Perchuk, Interim Director at the Getty Research Institute, and we are delighted to have Julia Elizabeth Neal, a former Getty scholar, with us. Julia has brought together an extraordinary interdisciplinary group of art historians, musicologists, musicians, and curators to showcase Patterson's work and enduring impact across the visual arts and experimental music. This evening's program reflects that depth of collaboration. We will begin with performances before a conversation between Julia, Valerie Cassell-Oliver, and Peter Frank, who will reflect on Patterson's sustained and generative relationship with both classical and experimental music. At the Getty, we're extremely proud to be the stewards of Benjamin Patterson's records, and our goal is to make his archives come alive through programs like this and open access publications such as the Scores Project, which is available free online as a digital publication, or if you want, you can buy the physical copy of the book as well in our bookstore or online. So now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Julia Elizabeth Neal, who specializes in modern contemporary art of the United States with a particular emphasis on African American art history. Her research examines the relationship between the visual and the conceptual and the ways that art participates in shaping identity, nationhood, and cultural scripts since World War II. Her first book project, which I'm very proud to say she wrote part of here at the Getty, is titled Methods and Processes, Benjamin Patterson and the Art of Discipline, which is out or soon to be out?
It will be out in the future.
It will soon be out. And builds on years of sustained archival and critical engagement, including her 2021 performance works within the State of Benjamin Patterson, a Catalog Raisonné, Volume 1. Her work has been supported by the Fulbright Commission, by us, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Ford Foundation, and other distinguished institutions. So please join me now in welcoming Julia and our performers.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the warm welcome. It is my pleasure to be away from the cold of Michigan and the bright, sunny heaven of California, specifically Los Angeles. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for making your way here to the Getty somehow, some way, as we witness the first official performance and recording of Patterson's score string music by two musicians who I will introduce in a moment. And this event today is very much anchored in three objectives, which began early in the morning with researchers, a pianist and composer by the name of Mark Hannaford, and also a cellist by the name of Katri Ervama, through the University of Michigan, who also performed scores that Patterson created in 1956 while a student, also at the University of Michigan. And one of the efforts of this program is to relink his aesthetic practice to an enduring love of classical music at the same time that he also immersed himself in experimental practices. The goals, I will say, are trifold. We want to highlight the generational stakes that emerged really by his interlocutors, musicians, and curators. And then we also, in this process, are reconsidering his legacy and relationship to Fluxus. What you will be witnessing are scores before its quote-unquote official birth in Wiesbaden in 1962, and then also have a moment in a public conversation to respond to his legacy. So it is my greatest goal here today to also amplify the voices of those who have been long-term stakeholders and those who are also actively engaging his legacy today. So we will start first with a performance of string music, and I would like to introduce the two musicians for us today. The first is Sean, and also the second is Scott. And if you'll allow me to read their biographies, verbatim, be a little patient with me so I can give you a sense of the depth of their practices, which is also key to what they'll present to us. Then after they perform, we are all going to perform a score called Paper Piece. It is a classical Fluxus piece. It will begin in the front here from a table where participants will then take the performance out into the audience. So I warmly welcome your participation. The score typically lasts between 10 to 12 minutes, but we're going to make a brilliant virtuosic effort within 5 minutes, if that is at all feasible and possible. After the performance of Paper Piece, then we're going to have a brief intermission and then come back for a public conversation with Valerie Cassell-Oliver and Peter Frank. Okay? So if you'll allow me, I would like to introduce Sean Griffin and then Scott Worthington in order. So Sean Griffin is a Tijuana-based composer, director, and artist, and is also the founder of Opera Pavera, a consortium dedicated to new opera and interdisciplinary performance. Working often in creative nonfiction, Griffin's work spans compositions, librettos, choreography, film, performance design, and drawing. His work has appeared at the Venice Biennale, MoMA, the Volksbühne, and the Broad, including installations with Charles Gaines, another major interlocutor of Ben Patterson's legacy, Catherine Sullivan, and operas with George Lewis, another pivotal voice in Patterson's history, Ron Athey, and Pauline Oliveros. So Sean is seated here in the black shirt with white stripes. Thank you so much. He will be on the harp. All right, and then allow me to introduce Scott Worthington, who enjoys a diverse career as a musician in Los Angeles. A quote-unquote masterful and transfixing bassist, he performs as a soloist in orchestras and recording studios and with improvisers and chamber groups. As a performer, composer, his albums have garnered critical acclaim. Prism, for example, was named one of the New Yorker's most notable classical albums of 2015 and was also called, quote-unquote, as bewitching as its original by Alex Ross. Scott's other releases have been praised by the New York Times, such as, quote-unquote, continually surprises and delights with tiny, glittering events, which I think we'll witness tonight. And the National Sawdust Log also noted, quietly gripping. He has received commissions from the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, Lode Bang, and the Isaura String Quartet, the Bjorn Kozar Duro, Synchrony, and numerous soloists. In 2025, his trio, Triple Shot, released their debut EP, First Flight, featuring compositions by all members of the ensemble. So this is my introduction of Scott Worthington for you all, who will be on the double bass, the instrument of Ben Patterson's expertise and profession. And before they perform, Sean is also going to make some general remarks. After they conclude the performance, we'll also have Scott making some comments or responses to what they have done for you all, okay? Well, please welcome everybody to the front. I'm going to move out of your way.
Hello, everybody. I am so honored to be here. The last time I was here, I believe, was 2000, the year 2000 or something, working in the David Tudor archive. And so I know how well they preserved that and how important it is. And so I'm just so thrilled to hear that Ben Patterson's work was also being collected and preserved here. I think about a lot of Fluxus work now, thinking about the Cold War and how freedom was depicted, especially during McCarthyism. I mean, a lot of modern painting and abstract expressions and things. This is McCarthy-era art, and it exposes, like in an international way, a kind of depiction of freedom of some kind. And it was like a procedural kind of event where the art was sort of shown around and put in shows and toured around, sort of depicting the freedom of the individual. And Ben Patterson within this, of course, there was total racial exclusion and all of that. And he sits in this place where, all of these contradictions meet up. And his work, I first encountered it, I think, in 1994 or something like that. And it sort of retools that mechanism. I mean, he was like in the military band in Germany, and he sort of retools this administrative structure to sort of to some beautiful ends where the art is not represented on a canvas or anything. It's through this enacted procedure where people are there, voices are there. So I really love his work for a lot of different reasons and how it's positioned there. And so in interpreting this piece, of course I'm playing the harp, which is not a bass, but it is a string instrument. It's scored for any string instrument with a bow, and I have a bow over there. So, but it's really an honor to be part of this. And I thank you so much for inviting me. I mean, it's such an honor and a pleasure. Thank you. And this is string piece.
Thanks so much. So that was string music, or at least one version of string music, our version. I think, oh, great, yes. So I wanted to talk for a little bit about how I went about using these materials to make what I played. So we heard about this kind of procedural, what goes into it, and this kind of mix of experimental and classical. And so what you see on the screen here is kind of an explanation of the symbols that I think were sort of rotating as we played. You know, A in a circle with a line over it means I should play an A sharp. A with the line going down, it's A flat, etc. There's all sorts of effects, soltasto over the fingerboard, ponticello close to the bridge, that really change the timbre and all these sorts of things. I began my part by playing Patterson's own realization that he includes in the score, because it's, you know, and his is extremely specific. I could go through and find the parts. So C 12-second rest, D is right there. There's a C, and then these circles, the black circles, add to 12 seconds of rest, and then I play the D. So I took these pages, these two pages with the graphic notation, and I made my own version that sort of resembles this, that you see on the screen now. But because we were going to do a longer performance, I tried to transcribe it in such a way that I could use or interpret the choices that he gives in this page, you know, newly each time. So I knew that I could play the pitches in any octave I wanted, but some of them are supposed to be open strings or harmonics, so I have to mark that so that I know what to do. And then I suppose I created what you just heard, and I mean, I practiced at home. I also made this electronic part that to the left he says you're allowed to do. So I've recorded some of my practicing with I guess, a nicer microphone like I'm using for my voice, and a type of mic that was quite popular in experimental music in the 60s, a contact microphone or piezo microphone. So that was the one that sounded, lots of people kind of think like it sounds like a rubber band or something on the bass. It sounds very strange, just as another timbre alteration. And then because he says that you can alter the frequency spectrum, but not the pitch or duration of things, I tried to pick some subtle-ish effects to put on the sound that would have been used in the 60s. So I used a ring modulator, if anyone knows what these sorts of things are, very subtly, and a little bit of a plate reverb. I, of course, did them like effectively with a computer. I did it with a guitar processor, but you know, digital representations, I don't have a plate reverb at home, as much fun as that might be to have. So anyway, I thought that would be interesting to know my process of developing what became this performance, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I will bring up Julia now to talk about Paper Piece.
Brava, brava. Thank you so much for your interpretation. This is upholding a central feature of Patterson's practice, which is multiplicity. So thank you so much for performing a variation of string music for us today. I am going to speak very briefly about Paper Piece and begin the performance within 5 minutes. And I'll do this as a way to connect us to the conversation that will follow. So Ben Patterson, born in 1934 and passed away in 2016, was a musician's musician. And I would be remiss if I did not thank the Getty for its institutional support, for the resources in terms of persons, and the stewardship of his archives that allow us to access and rethink and recontextualize. And what was so central to Patterson was also the community he built. So I want to thank Thisbe, who has been a very important interlocutor for making this program possible. Janani and William, and absolutely the audio, visual, and tech masterminds that help us hear the audibility and also be able to witness this in recordings in the future. So, Paper Piece. It emerged in stark contrast to something like string music. He is and was a deeply analytical mind, and Paper Piece was a major threshold in his practice where he was seeking a release from the arduous labor of rehearsals. Part of the narrative is that he was taken aback by David Tudor's expression of rehearsing for Karlheinz Stockhausen's Contacta for about 120 hours. He found it to be such an absurd situation that in pulling from the material of his everyday experience in a very small and meager apartment in a war-torn Cologne, found some central and pivotal value in everyday material, specifically paper. And in thinking about paper, he was curious of its sonic qualities. So Patterson, in my research, I have found, to my dismay but also love, would retitle almost every single one of his works, recontextualize almost every single one of his works, have different directions for every single one of his works. Okay, so this originally emerged in 1960 as Paper Piece for 5 players, and now there is variations where it ends not at 12 minutes, but it literally concludes once all paper material has been exhausted. So if we can rip and tear, that's going to be amazing. And some of the scores, he's encouraging different sonic qualities, such as rumpling, bumpling, popping, ripping apart. And I'm going to begin Paper Piece by a rupture. So I would like to invite the participants from today's program, if you would like to join me here on this proscenium, and I will talk to you pretty quickly. Mark, Ketri, come on down. You guys want to come on over? Yes, yes, yes. And we will conclude with my amateurish conductor's gesture of finality, okay? So the paper will make its way to you. Please feel to accept us or reject us and join in a sonic expression together before the conversation, okay? Paper Piece from 1960. Thank you so much for our impromptu collective sonic and invocation of Ben Patterson's spirit in this space. We're going to break for an intermission. Please come back by 6:20 so you can also hear from some of the longer stakeholders and interlocutors in Ben Patterson's history. Thank you so much. So as everybody is trickling back in, I am going to go ahead and dive into our esteemed conversants or conversators or speakers or guest folk today. Insofar as you will need to make it back down the hill to get home. So I want to make sure that the conversation unfolds within the time that we have left this evening. And the two people that I've invited tonight have been major stakeholders and central to my own research for having taken Patterson's career, his deeply analytical mind, and his experimental aesthetics seriously. And through this, I have found the power in the multimodal ways that curating and display also helps steward his legacy, and then also in terms of writing. So the two people that I have today are quite esteemed and already reputed in their career, but that doesn't preclude me from reintroducing them to you. So of the two speakers, I'll begin with Valerie Kessel-Oliver, who is the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Prior to her position at the VMFA, she was senior curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston from 2000 to 2017. At CAM, she organized numerous exhibitions, including the acclaimed Double Consciousness Black Conceptual Art since 1970, as well as Radical Presence, Black Performance and Contemporary Art, and major survey exhibitions for artists such as Donald Moffat, Benjamin Patterson, the first and major U.S. retrospective of him, Jenny C. Jones, Angel Otero, and Annabeth Rosen. Her debut at the VMFA was the critically acclaimed retrospective entitled Howardina Pindell, What Remains to Be Seen, which was co-organized with Naomi Beckwith in 2018. In 2021, she opened the groundbreaking exhibition, The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse that toured nationally. And since then, she's organized numerous exhibitions, including Dawood Bey, Elegy, which is now on tour at the New Orleans Museum of Art and until early 2026. And she's also organized exhibitions of Ted Jones, Theaster Gates, Robert Rauschenberg, and is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including the Getty Research Institute in 2007, the Center for Curatorial Leadership in 2009, as well as the reputed award, the David C. Driscoll Award through the High Museum in Atlanta in 2011, as well as the James A. Porter Book Award from Howard University, as well as the Landlock International Arts Award at the Detroit Institute of Art. In October 2023, she was also tapped to curate Spotlight, a section for Frieze Masters Art Fair in London, a role which she will reprise this fall. Okay, yeah. And I could go on and on about Valerie Kessel-Oliver, but for the benefit of time, your achievements must be limited in this moment. And now I would like to introduce Peter Frank, who is a New York-born, LA-based art critic, historian, and curator. He has guest-curated exhibitions at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the El Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia, German is my language, so please excuse me, the Center for Inter-American Relations, the Alternative Museum, which is also key in Patterson's legacy, Franklin Furnace Archive, and the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, among others. He has realized projects for Documenta and the Venice Biennale, and he has written extensively for Art in America. He's a deeply prolific writer, including publications in Art News, Artillery, White Hot Magazine, and other periodicals, and has served as the art critic for the Soho Weekly News, the Village Voice, and the LA Weekly. Numerous exhibition monographs and catalogs feature his essays, and he has published several books. Lectured across the nation and internationally, is a published poet and also a Fluxus Artist, non-artist. He'll explain it in his own words. Yeah, exactly. So with that, I would like to invite everybody to the front so we could dive into the generational stakes that they too represent. Thank you.
Seated in the middle? Or do you want, how do you want us?
This is good. I'll be right here.
Okay.
I already drank.
Sorry, we didn't rehearse this part.
So, in the arc of Ben Patterson's life, he defines a retirement from 1965 to roughly 1989. He retired from quote-unquote art making. And he returned in New York City through a solo exhibition at the Emily Harvey Gallery, but also was part of an exhibition that Peter curated at the Alternative Museum. So Peter in Patterson's legacy represents the 1980s and also a long-term stakes in his career, whereas Valerie has undertaken a massive project through research and curation in the early aughts of the 21st century. And I thought that in amplifying the stakeholders and interlocutors of Patterson's career for you all, I would wonder especially what the first encounter you might have had. What was the first encounter that led you to take him seriously as an innovator and a contributor to post-war performance and sound art practices?
Me.
In whichever order you all prefer.
Okay. Well, I was introduced to Ben Patterson through Jeffrey Hendricks. And in that kind of context, we were mounting the Yoko Ono exhibition that had traveled to Houston. I was the coordinating curator for my museum, and John, who helped organize that exhibition, was there to assist in installing. And throughout the week long that we were together, he kept saying, I wish you could meet Ben. I think you would love Ben. You and Ben would get on so well. And it wasn't until we were installing the ephemera for the exhibition, and there was several photos of the piano activity. Philip Corner's piano activity. And I looked down and I pointed and I said, who's the black man in the photograph? And he goes, that's Ben. I've been telling you all along you would love Ben. And I thought, you're absolutely right, I would love Ben. And I initially thought of him as a foundational figure for the exhibition Double Consciousness, which was really looking at conceptual art practices with the big C and then the subsequent generations with the smaller C. But as I started delving deeper and deeper into Ben's work, I realized that what he was doing preceded conceptual art practices. And secondly, that so much of his work needed to be explored in a way that was more concentrated. So we skipped over double consciousness and went straight for looking at Ben in a much deeper, profound way, not just the scores for happenings and gestures, but for the visual arts that he was creating as well once he moved back to Germany. So it was kind of a no-brainer. It was clear that he was part of a core group which began in the early 1960s with Fluxus, and that as a whole, his presence there being so radical, kind of radical presence within a radical grouping, that he really deserved a more focused lens on the work.
And Peter, your first encounter with Fluxus was in 1963, correct? So I'm curious when you began to take Patterson seriously as well.
As soon as I became aware of his existence, which was with the book The Four Suits, published by the Something Else Press, which anthologized Ben's work with that of Alison Knowles, Philip Corner, and Thomas Schmidt. For artists who came from radically different contexts and backgrounds, but whose work seemed to overlap in terms of attitude and practice. There was a great deal. It was the editor, Dick Higgins, himself a multivariant artist, was trying to emphasize that there was no boundary between the arts, finally, that intermedia had become a proposition wherein words, notations, sounds, meanings, gestures, and time itself were all part of any given realization, performative, visual, or auditory. This intermedia context, this intermedia approach fascinated me too at the age of 13, 14. And when I saw Ben's work in this book, it seemed perfectly natural. There were, if I remember, 3 sections to the book in decreasingly theoretical language, by which time the third had become almost poetical, like haiku, or like the verbal scores I'd seen produced by Fluxus artists like George Brecht and Yoko Ono. I derived a similar enchantment from Ben's work, certainly that third portion of his appearance in the book. I didn't meet Ben till I don't know how much later, but fairly much later.
And so we've been treating 2 different versions of Ben Patterson today. Ben Patterson, the classical musician, Ben Patterson, the experimental musician, and Ben Patterson, the artist who was open to indeterminacy and expanded forms of music and sonic expression. And what I've been able to find in archives is that he calls himself so many things. He's a conceptual artist, he's a happenings artist, he's a Fluxus artist, he's not a Fluxus artist, he's a performance artist, and he's everything that he claims to be in terms of radical practices.
Does he claim to be a painter?
That's actually one thing he doesn't. So we rarely associate objects with Patterson's work. They come later in the 1980s and forward, even though he has puzzle poems and his artist book, Methods and Processes, in 1962. I wonder how you guys come to understand him in and outside of Fluxus. And I have some slides that I can show and cycle through with a clicker as we're speaking that assembles just images related to Ben Patterson when he was younger, as well as his artwork that I'll just click through as we're having a conversation.
So the question again was?
How do we understand him in and outside of Fluxus?
Well, Fluxus becomes it becomes codified, I think, almost in the context of being a new Dada, neo-Dada. And it feels very appropriately framed for kind of a post-World War II response to a kind of authority. It's about pushing against something, but it also spawns off so many different movements, if you will. I mean, what's this trilogy of intermedia, performance, and Fluxus in a way. It's triangulated, and yet it disperses as we move forward in time, and evolves and morphs. And many people spin off to spaces of dance and performance and theater and different types of music and literature. So it begins to set up foundations for so many things. So I think it's apt that Ben kind of considers himself in all of these different spaces, because that becomes a part of an evolution that takes place. I feel so.
Nothing sums up Fluxus,
No, it's true.
but everything defines it.
Yes.
And we have to remember that as a phenomenon, as an artistic phenomenon, as a movement, Fluxus begins in music. Ben would have felt right at home in Fluxus at its earliest iterations, coming out of the John Cage, the new school course that John Cage taught, and that was succeeded. Cage was succeeded at by Richard Maxfield, that which is the version that George Maciunas, the founder of Fluxus, took, and was as important in its own way to Fluxus as the Cage classes were. So if we have to start with music in terms of understanding what Fluxus was or how Fluxus emerged. The first Fluxus concert was called Neo-Dada in der Musik. Actually, the first Fluxus presentation of any type. There were exhibits of objects at the Gallery Parnasse in Wuppertal, near Cologne, in the early 60s. And I think Ben performed there or exhibited there, along with people like Namjoon Paik and Wolf Astel and Charlotte Moorman. But that aside, it was entirely a musical presentation until it gets over back to the United States. Because before Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles bring it back to the States, and George Maciunas comes back to the States himself, there are a series of concerts, starting with the one in Wiesbaden that Ben was part of. And there were other, it was sort of like a merry band of pranksters, of musical non-performers, anti-performers, going from Wiesbaden to Copenhagen, to Amsterdam, to Paris, to the south of France, wherever somebody knew somebody. And that's how the Fluxus network came about. But Ben was at the inception, at the core of this this mobile network that Fluxus was.
It's beautiful. I think one of the, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it starts at that moment with Mary Bauermeister in that studio as a counterpoint to this festival of music that was happening. And they became the Festival of New Music, a different counter-festival to that convening that was taking place. But there you had, Christian Wolff and, Namjoon Paik and David Tudor, and everyone was there, which was Ben's first major introduction to this constellation of artists. And even the scores that were written in the immediacy of that, if they weren't written for an instrument or for voice, it was written for gestures that created a sonic dimension, that everyday gestures of movement and walking, or paper being waved, or torn or crumpled, they had these sonic dimensions to them.
Right.
So you're absolutely correct that music becomes this sort of gravitational pull for many of these artists. And I would then venture to say literature becomes a major kind of marriage to that.
Right. Even so, though, it does not privilege the musically trained.
Right, exactly.
It proposes a kind of musical endeavor in which audience is as skilled as performers, and anyone and everyone can join in, sort of like the radical version of Handel Messiah or something.
Yes. It breaks down that fourth wall between the audience and the performer,
Right.
in the same way of pushing against this sort of classicist idea of performer and viewer or attendee, and allows the everyday. It still pushes against this sort of notion of authority and hierarchy within spaces, cultural spaces.
In 1964, Patterson had published a confession where he is theorizing or situating his work and its objectives. So I think maybe now is time to restate what he claims his work does in this context, given your recent exchange. And it's also something that musicologist George E. Lewis has really amplified in his scholarship about Ben Patterson in terms of music experimentation and its intersection with performance. Part of this confession, Patterson says, quote, "My pieces, as they appear on paper, have neither material nor abstract value. They can only acquire value in their execution, and only then the personal value that the participant perceives in himself and or towards society during and or after the experience. In fact, every piece is just this person who consciously does this and or that. Anyone can do it, and it happens as a quote-unquote workshop, such as Paper Piece, as we all collectively performed today." And this raises a question for me, since you both have stewarded his art through curation. What are some of the challenging or rewarding experiences in the process of curating Ben Patterson, especially since his work spans so many different sensibilities?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Born in the State of Fluxus, I mean, it was a 50-year retrospective in which we did try to, I attempted to embrace all facets of his practice. I mean, even the ordinary life that he led. So it starts very early on with the scores. You're seeing the book there, Born in the State of Fluxus. His volume of collected poems, it's sort of an arc or chronology through object making, quite frankly, whether it's the annotated scores or the books that he created or the puzzle poems that he created, and then onward to the objects itself, many of which were in Europe in collections, between points in Italy and Germany and even as far away as Japan. So, I mean, there were many things that spread out, but even those things, even in his administrative work, and that's not to be understated because he also says he took a break from being a creator or an artist because mouths had to be fed. And so Ben also took graduate work and became a librarian. He has a master's in library science and supported many of the artists that he aligned himself with. So he worked in administration, in colleges, in grant making, creating fellowships for experimental music to be supported by grants, and became a representative of many of the experimental music musicians through his sort of representational Ben Patterson Limited, his artist representation business. So it sort of encompassed everything, and unwieldy so, but almost in this same kind of chaotic way was very much aligned, and you saw these sort of parallels that happened between how he created music and annotating music to object making. And a lot of the objects were related to music. So it was a nice brew, so to speak.
it's interesting to think that in working in so many distinct formats, not to mention media, but formats that Ben never quite developed, and I think this was deliberate, never quite developed a look, a style, a brand. What so many of the Fluxus artists did. You could tell that that's a Yoko Ono from a mile away. You can tell that that's a George Brecht from half a mile away.
Or an Al Hansen. You're absolutely right, yeah.
But Ben, he would sooner imitate a friend of his than do something in which he was forcing himself to be original. I don't think he was the only such artist in Fluxus, but this, it struck me almost from seeing that book, seeing his contribution to Four Suits, struck me as where is Ben's touch? Mm-hmm. And Ben's touch is up here. Ben's touch is also here. You know, his touch is other people. He's not an original artist. He's a summative artist.
I mean, I would. There isn't a distinct style like Al Hansen would have a distinct style in terms of the use of materials, but I think in very much like this conceptual practice, I think Ben would utilize whatever materials felt apt for the thing that he was creating, for the thing he wanted to say. So there would be Ben working in marble, but there is a sort of through line in it in the sense of the play on words. Yeah. And I mean, it is very cerebral in that respect, or this idea that if it didn't sound like a palindrome, then it would be the thing created that looks like the thing it is, like a fedora made of white Carrara marble, or sausages made of marble that would hang like in the sausage. Right. So it was a play, and it is a through line, I think, with the work, the way he plays with language and words and objects.
And it's an ideology of play. I mean, he's playing almost demonstratively to invite others into the sense of play.
Yes.
I don't know if that contradicts how I just described him or extends it. I think it does both.
Yeah. I mean, like I remember a series of rail lines that were happening in Wiesbaden, and the lines ended, but they had names of composers like Wewel, and what he would do was to take the actual signs from the trains that were the lines that were no longer running, and then he would actually create an audio guide of all the things people would see on the stops of those lines. But it was beautiful because you had to pick up these objects. So again, very much a hearkening to something that is there, but a play on language, a play on words, but also a play on experiences.
Exactly. And in certain times, he anticipated what his fellow Fluxus artists did. For instance, that paper piece could have been Alison Knowles, but it's Alison Knowles avant la lettre.
But something like Paper Piece actually was a much earlier iteration, which happens in a letter sent home to his family. So in that respect, I think he was thinking of how to be present in his absence, but then because his family was so musical, there's a beautiful image of Ben as a young man at Penn High School in the band, and there's also he's in this second, I guess he is there somewhere in this one, but if you look at the beautiful brown girl in the very front is his sister Betty. Right here. And so he comes from a family which embraces music. There's a piano in the home. I believe his mother plays
Yes.
piano.
Yes.
So the family itself is very musical. And I get the sense that when they were home together, they had these pastimes where they played music together. So because he wasn't there, he sends a letter home so that they can actually perform this piece using gift wrap paper. So it's the paper from the gifts that are crumbled and torn, and they create this musical piece together. And in his absence, he's there, present, because he's kind of presenting the score to his family. So
Yes, he also learned piano and violin within his house. And as Elizabeth Patterson tells it, she also notes that most of their day-to-day in their living rooms involved listening to classical music all day. That's what they imbibed as a genre, and it's something that they practiced their entire lives. And across these yearbooks of his time at Penn High, you could also see his sister, Betty Patterson, present almost every step of the way. They had a deep friendship. She considers him, for example, her hero. And if I want to connect many of these ideas around like hearkening and ideology of play, Patterson's work really sits in contradictions. And so some of the images that I had up in the background showed him as one of few among a majoritarian group of other people. He grew up in Pennsylvania, if I can go back.
Blame it on Pittsburgh.
Yes, and
In Pittsburgh, yeah.
they would regularly socialize in the East End and Liberty Hills neighborhood of Pittsburgh. If I can go back, there we go. He was one of a few, and that also included his sister. She too also trained at the University of Michigan. And one of the core features of their attempt at discipline and excellence was also this desire to be better than so as to be recognized and not erased, which really feeds into the complexity of erasure that complicates the prominence of Black creatives in histories of the United States especially. So I wonder, because I think we might be moving into a conversation around legacy. Yeah?
No. Okay, all right.
Yeah? Okay.
We're just getting started.
I know. Legacy is central. Patterson has catalyzed a number of performance practices and conceptual practices across artists of different nationalities, ethnicities, and quote-unquote racialized identities. And Valerie, there's something in your scholarship that you have especially held up, which is this idea that perhaps Patterson was the godfather of Black performance art. So I'm wondering now, here in this moment, if we could just hear you think through how you arrived at this claim.
Well, part of my very storied life and career is that I worked for a time at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And a lot of the students would come into my office and oftentimes bemoan the fact that what they were being taught in the university never included people who looked like them. And so, I mean, one could go all the way back. If one is looking at performance art, particularly by Black bodies, we can go back to Cakewalk. I mean, but for all intent and purposes, for a kind of academic and canon framing, Ben sits in that space. He sits in the 1960s, which becomes so foundational to contemporary art practices. And so if we want to look at genealogy, then we look no further in terms of a grandfather figure or a foundational figure in someone like Ben, who not only comes out of music and brings music, but also introduces gesture and scores for action, which is the seeds for performance practice.
Isn't Ben exactly contemporary with Sun Ra?
He would be two different angles, absolutely two different angles, and not within the same through line. I think certainly by the time Sun Ra is at the zenith or in the power of his work, Ben is working as an administrator. So they're not parallels there. And they can't be considered, because Ben is coming primarily from a classical standpoint, and it's very rare. I think there's only one instance in which I actually see him delve deep into any kind of sort of jazz.
Yes.
And it's not
Yes.
even experimental jazz. It's almost like straight ahead jazz. And so, Sun Ra coming from Bessemer, Alabama, I mean, there's a whole, there is a class issue, not a class issue, but a class framing here. Ben is solidly middle class, upper middle class. And I think that therein lies a kind of rupture of wanting to fold him into blues, jazz. There's improvisation through repetition. And I think it's more repetition than improvisation. It becomes almost intellectualized rather than intuitive, if that makes sense.
The other challenge, in my mind, to Ben's nomination as Godfather of Black Performance Art would be Ted Jones.
Oh, yes, yes.
Whom we were talking about earlier.
And Ted comes out of music, but out of a kind of jazz idiom, and parlays that into spoken word through the beat poets. And also becomes a visual artist, but unlike Ben as a collagist or as someone who, assemblage, which is Ben's kind of specialty, Ted is actually painting, he's actually drawing, he's using watercolor, and he embraces surrealism as his kind of point of entry into the arts. But yeah, I mean, as Coltrane will say, we're all dipping from the same well, we're all dipping into the same well. But to very different ends, and I love it because it implodes this notion that there is a kind of monolithic way of approaching or being within the arts, even the avant-garde arts.
And some of his organizing efforts were entirely focused on trying to usurp seemingly neutral categories of music, like classical music or even jazz music, from what was a genre predominantly reflective of white contributions in the United States through the Society of Black Composers, which organized even some of Sun Ra's work. So Patterson and Sun Ra knew of each other, and he helped organize one of his performances, and also through the Symphony of the New World, which Patterson and others claim as the first fully integrated or racially integrated orchestra in the United States, which was predominantly musicians of color. They were trying to claim or reclaim the power of these categories without pursuing singularly a racialized title, such as quote-unquote black music. Very much between 1968 to 1972, Patterson and others were trying to theorize what was quintessentially black within music in general, especially in the United States.
Music at that time, because the same discussion had been pertaining before the war among people like William Grant Still and William Dawson, Florence Price.
Yes. Yes.
But they were framing it entirely in terms of European classical modes.
Okay.
And the putting in an African American presence with the inclusion of provocative themes, melodies. In other words, claiming American music as an African American music, rather than the other way around.
I saw that we had 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes before the Q&A. Okay. So then I would like to then ask One final question, which is also about legacy, and in this context, his legacy within Fluxus. Because in his self-interview, he had been critical of some of the political limitations of Fluxus as a sensibility, Fluxus as a quote-unquote official movement, as historicized through the efforts of George Maciunas. How do we see Patterson's Fluxus, legacy in Fluxus today?
Oh, well, he's central. I mean, there's a question he says, how do I know so much about Fluxus? And he said, precisely because I was there at its birth.
Yes.
And so he's very central to Fluxus, and he's very central to all of the very early activities that happened, precisely because he was there in Europe at that time and was able to coordinate and help organize and present a lot of these events.
Yes.
And he was present at these performances. Setting the building on fire, I guess. But yeah, I mean, so there's no, I mean, even though Maciunas would regularly excommunicate people for varying infractions, if you look at the genealogy, Ben is central.
Well, I don't think he ever did.
He never, no.
Excommunicated Ben.
I think Ben self-exported.
Right.
So, but then it came back, of course, and participated.
Church of Fluxus.
He called Fluxus a laboratory, a platform, and in his later years, he described Fluxus as this great ship. So it's like this conduit or this platform that allowed some of the power of art and the ideologies of change and progress to really flow through his creative efforts.
The question remains how much Fluxus was a realization of this change and how much it was a representation
Yes.
of the possibility of change, which sounds like, two sides of the same coin, but in fact is an important distinction in the practices of the time.
Yeah, I think Ben also, in terms of kind of political dimension to it, Ben felt that there was so much radicality in Fluxus when it existed in Europe, because it wasn't dealing with the issues that were present in the U.S. It could take on the French culture and their activities in Algeria and in northern Africa where there was suppression, but they couldn't march on Washington. And that's when he felt that real distinct rupture for himself, even though his work was not about presenting his blackness. He couldn't extrapolate his blackness from being there, and expected the same advocacy, whether they were in Paris or Germany or in the US. And when he did not see that correlation and that translation, that began his course in thinking slightly differently about Fluxus.
Right. Well, Ben wasn't seeking a kind of a message like David Hammond's was, or Pope L. These are explicitly making a statement or various statements where Ben preferred to infer.
But he can infer in a very provocative way.
That's why he preferred to infer. I think I get the feeling that his own impulse was so strong that he felt the need to modify his own, not the message itself, but the medium by which the message was conveyed.
I think like peace, I would say that is probably the most provocative, lick piece, the score itself, which is in Methods and Processes, says, take, if I'm paraphrasing, find a shapely woman, cover her in whipped cream,
Yes.
lick, ... nuts, and cherries optional. So oftentimes when this piece was performed, it was performed with a shapely white woman, and Ben being among other men, licking the whipped cream off of the body. So do the math, this is 1964, and there are laws on the books in several states, even in the United States, that would have had him arrested for doing that. So to say that there wasn't a kind of political dimension to him, I think misses the subtle, it's not subtle, but subtle in the sense that it's embedded in these scores for action. Yeah.
Interestingly, though, it also manifests the feminist implications of Fluxus, because it's as much. Well, I mean, there's a discussion to this day. Was it sexist? Was it a sexist piece or a feminist piece? And the answer is yes.
To both. It was very much a sexist piece, if you ask me.
If you look at it in the context of, say, Carolee Schneemann.
Well, she's, yeah.
I mean, and in 1964, 65, Carolee might have volunteered to be the
Lady Eisenhower,
the lady under the licking.
Well, Carolee also shares some friction with Fluxus due to her expression of her own agency with her body. So there's something of a complicated intersection with Carolee, but we were also treated very much today to musicians who were reading Patterson closely. And I think as people continue to revisit him, they will read him closely and see very strong messages that are difficult to ignore today. Like in Seminar, imagine that Patterson's primary audience were his Fluxus fellows. And to be in a moment in the Flux Hall doing something like Seminar, where there are prompts that ask his fellow Fluxus members, like Allison Knowles, who performed a lot of his work, did you march? Did you march on Washington? That is a direct address to his friends. That's really significant. That's also digging at some of the politics of Fluxus, potentially its limitations politically, potentially the civic rhetoric that's not modeled in everyday life. But there are two sensibilities that are dominant right now in scholarship on Patterson. People are far fascinated with the quote-unquote funny black man. And that then means that in reading his work seriously and thinking about the analytical breakdown of notation in classical music and experimentation, that's something that is often sidelined. And then his work appears as ephemera in so many different ways. You have to sit with a bulk of material from somebody who was behind a typewriter often, at his desk often, cutting papers, typewriting, printing, which he did even later into his life, even while he was making objects. I think perhaps in considering reading Patterson closely, I don't want to transition too quickly to the Q&A, because I feel like we have a loose thread right now. But if not, maybe we can open it up to folk who have questions for us. All right. Do we pass this around? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm still a little bit lost. What is exactly Fluxus? If you guys could define it to a 10-year-old, in a way, if you're trying to explain to them what Fluxus is.
Can you restate that? Because for some odd reason, every one of your phonetic elements just mushed together for me.
No worries. Could you define what Fluxus is to a 10-year-old if you were to explain it? Because I'm still a little bit lost exactly to what that is.
So, defining Fluxus, I think in many ways, because it comes primarily out of music, I would say defining it would be distilling music, gestures, actions into democratizing a kind of creative pathway, if that makes sense. Okay, that's not quite clear. So I would say very much like scores for action, ways that people, it breaks that fourth wall in some interesting ways by enabling, democratizing things like music so that everyone can do it. It's like paper piece. It is a score which can be performed by everyone. So you're taking something which is in many ways, that takes many years, if you will, to master, and enabling people to utilize themselves and paper and everyday objects as instruments that can create melodic, beautiful, unexpected, spontaneous sounds. It's collapsing a hierarchy. I would like to say it is about collapsing hierarchies. In other words, you could create assemblage works and collage pieces. Puzzle poems become things that are pulled together that allows people to construct poetry in a way that is both spontaneous but also poetic and interesting. So to me, it is a democratizing of things which oftentimes felt very elitist, if that makes sense. I don't know if that,
Works for me.
Okay, all right.
And I'll add, there are many different ways to approach answering this. And if I could just
Yes.
add an additional layer to what you've identified in terms of construction, there's Fluxus, the historical phenomenon that has a name attached to a very specific period of art production. And then there's Fluxus that has been a vocabulary to retroactively describe certain art sensibilities, for which Patterson was one of the chief theorists for, creating work between 1958 to 1960. So if we think about Fluxus as a quote-unquote official movement.
Yeah, you're describing capital F Fluxus
Yeah.
as opposed to small f Fluxus.
Yeah. Through George Maciunas, Lithuanian immigrant who was quite fascinated by all these new media sensibilities, who found himself within these circles of experimental musicians in an internationalizing Western Germany. He was thinking about after the failure of a magazine for the Lithuanian immigrant community in New York City, and through the gallery efforts that he had here, he was very much interested in new aesthetic practices. And he has these very brilliant graphs where he's trying to delineate Dada from concrete poetry and so forth. Fluxus for him represented a sensibility that embraced destabilization, flux as a word from the dictionary that he used to describe this was also a vocabulary for flow. And that connects exactly to what Valerie was describing when it comes to Fluxus as an effort to try to democratize the art experience. So these musicians are coming from classically trained backgrounds, exhausted by the decorum of their disciplines, and they were trying to seek different sonic registers. So in many ways of thinking about their innovations and their aesthetic progress, they started extrapolating and bringing and participating in experimental music practices too. And by doing that, they wanted to remove the artist as the central authority or figure from which an art experience occurs, which gets to this idea of the democratization of art. It's meant to create a horizontal relationship across the disciplines versus one that is vertical, where there's this authority figure who's interpreting or creating a work. And that also really resonated with post-war Western countries seeking different modalities of democratic participation among communities. So Fluxus is many, many different things. You can broach it through the history, right? And then, or you could broach it through the ways that Machunas and others built paradigms of what Fluxus was. And then you could also think through the efforts of people whose work ends up being part of the umbrella that he associates with Fluxus, which was officially born in September of 1962 in Wiesbaden, Germany.
If you want a one-sentence definition of Fluxus, it's the missing link between happenings and conceptual art.
Yes. And I think very beautifully stated. I think it's also the fact that it's called Neo-Dada and precisely the timing of it. We're coming out of World War II, and this is a generation that's coming out of World War II, a new generation coming out of that, very much like there was a generation coming out of World War I. And so Dada meant getting back to the very essence and intuitive way of creating sound and creating art. So this idea of going back to an intuitive source of creative activity.
And at the same time mocking the hierarchies,
Right.
hierarchical structures that Europeans had time and again proven treacherous.
And they're thinking about recent events too. Marcel Duchamp lectures on the creative act, and within this lecture, he says the audience is what finishes the work of art. Right?
Neo-Dada, in fact, was a term already used in visual art,
Right.
with reference to the Nouveau Réaliste in Paris and Milan, or the group in Düsseldorf, the Zero Group in Düsseldorf. Extreme experimental groups in which individual artists both stood out for themselves and contributed to a larger whole, a larger message of a new type of Dada that critiqued a continent gone mad twice.
Right. This sort of pseudo-civility that existed in art. So it was sort of going back to a kind of intuitive essence of allowing everyone to be engaged in this rather than the hierarchy. It's imploding the hierarchy at every turn. Yeah.
By the way, there was an implicit support in Neo-Dada for the emergent post-colonial countries that began declaring their independence or gaining it in the mid-50s. And of course, the majority of these countries were in Africa.
And also Japan, who was rebuilding after the bombing. So there's a large Fluxus contingent also in Japan. So I think wherever you go, wherever this moment of rebuilding needs to take place and take shape.
Exactly. A few years later, the same impulses manifest in Korea, in South Korea, and kind of a neo-Dada emerges there. But and Namjoon Paik becomes a kind of prophet without a country, or prophet, and then the country reclaims him.
We have time
Did we
for
hit
one
it?
more question.
Okay, good.
We have time for one more question. I see a hand. I see multiple hands. I leave it to a democratic vote. Oh, gosh. Okay.
Oh.
I'm so sorry we don't have enough time for more questions.
Well, how music travels versus visual art and kind of breaking through the language barriers, and certainly Marcel Duchamp, French, but he's very open to American. He comes to California, but the whole kind of Pacific, not only Japan, but the whole Pacific realm. Did they connect with the Pacific region as well somehow? I mean, everyone kind of comes together from Europe into New York. There's a lot of, so I'm just.
So a quote-unquote official Fluxus as a historical paradigm, to get back to that, had outposts where individuals would undertake the organization of events. And so there was a Fluxus West, to the extent of which its relationship was connected to a larger Pacific region. I can't answer that. But there
I
was a
don't think
Fluxus
so.
West and a Fluxus East, and Fluxus's main base in the mid-60s forward was in New York City. But there is some complications when it comes to Fluxus practices, especially through live action and embodiment and so forth, such that there have been some risked interpretations that equate what they're doing with the Gutai group in Japan. But there were figures very prominently associated with Fluxus, including Yoko Ono, who was holding events in her loft in New York City, which was also a major site for George Maciunas, as his enthusiasm around what we now call Fluxus, was developing. But I do know a scholar who is very much invested in contemporary Japanese art that I would love to connect you with.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but was the question about the Pacific?
The Pacific.
Filiu, I think is his
Robert
name.
Filiu?
Robert Filiu,
Who's
who
French.
I read he studied at UCLA and kind of was doing work in Los Angeles right here. So anyway, they're interesting.
He was also a close friend of Patterson. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's, what I've known is Europe, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, because there's a big outpost in Eastern Europe, as well as Japan. But I think it could...
Eastern Europe is a special case with Fluxus, not least because Fluxus's founder, Maciunas, came from Lithuania and maintained his contacts with the Lithuanian, not avant-garde, the Lithuanian group in exile, especially around New York. Although the fact that Maciunas himself was a socialist pissed off the rest of the Lithuanians no little bit, as you can imagine. But Fluxus stood as a special model for freedom, or at least for a kind of surreptitious freedom among the Central Europeans and even Europeans Eastern Europeans. In fact, Maciunas' childhood friend, Vytautas Landsbergis, was the one Fluxus artist behind in the USSR itself. He was based in Vilnius, but he was behind not just the Iron Curtain, like the Poles and the Czechs, such as Milan Knížák, et cetera. But there he was in the USSR itself. Landsbergis went on to become the first president of an independent Lithuania.
Yeah. And also Scandinavia also. So, I think they describe Fluxus as the first international kind of...
Well, the impulse, particularly the impulse to work in time as well as space.
Yes.
And to erase the distinctions between was something that people then associated with Fluxus, not least because they were looking for somewhere to place their own work and those of their peers. And Fluxus became an umbrella term.
Yes.
Yeah. And so one of the most radical propositions of Fluxus, surprisingly so, is community. Community that offers the patient space for experimentation, iterative actions, and also conceptualizations of new models of art working. And approaches performances and so forth. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up the conversation like now. So I want to thank you for remaining with us, and thank you so much for participating in this iteration of Ben Patterson. And I hope that in your performance of Paper Piece, you also understand the potential for future performances, individually and collectively, that you might do for Patterson that continues to keep alive his legacy in the way that Valerie and Peter's work has also performed for us.
And thank you, Julia, for all of what you've done to extend this legacy. So thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the beautiful night of Los Angeles.